And of course, in the Haggadah it says, Kulanu Chachamim, Kulanu Nedonim, and whatever level of education and knowledge you have, we all have to be, we know that, Misaper B'Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. Kol Yemeha, that's the commandment of Leil HaSeder. And we remember Yetziat Mitzrayim every day in our davening and in many, many ways. And the Sipur of the Shoah, is, for many people, it is also something they carry with them every single day. But for us as Am Yisrael, this is our one day to be Misaper B'Sipurim of the Shoah, and a day for us to dedicate to that memory on Yom HaShoah. And really, the most significant way for you to connect with what happened to people, to the Jews in the Shoah, would be to really hear it from a survivor. And I'm sure that many of you have even grandparents, perhaps, who were survivors, and you have heard the stories directly from the survivors. They were the witnesses to history. They are the ones for whom, it is really a living story for whom to hear it from. But of course, as the years pass, every year, the community of survivors diminishes year by year. And, in a way, I feel like I'm a stand-in, because my parents should be the one. If they were here, it would be so much more meaningful for you to hear it from my parents. But since they are no longer here, the next best thing is to at least hear it from someone who has that direct connection, and that is coming from me. So again, I appreciate the invitation, and I brought a few pictures. What I would like to do is basically, as the stand-in for my parents, whose names were Sally, Sarah, and Isaac Levinstein, I would like to tell you their story, and I have some pictures to share with you as well. Not many, but some. And then leave time so that you can ask questions, and I will do my best to answer as much as I know. So the story, and I know that you know the story, you know the history, it's not new to you. They were, what makes every survivor story is unique, because every survivor story is their story, and what happened to them is their remarkable, their remarkable way of how they survived. My parents, it was always a little bit different for me growing up, and I grew up in a community in New Jersey where there were many survivor families. In fact, as a kid, when I was little, going to Kita Aleph and Bet, I never met an adult who didn't speak with an accent except for the teachers in the school. Everybody I knew had accents when they spoke English, or barely spoke English. I grew up speaking Yiddish. But my parents most of the survivors were very young, and they were be'erech like 20, 21 years old, many of them, when they survived the war. My parents were older, and that put us in a little bit of a different category, and I felt that growing up. My parents were already married. Do the math in your heads. In 1931, my mother grew up in a small shtetl about 40 kilometers south of Krakow, Poland, and my father was from another shtetl in Poland, and they met in a coffee house. They just met with a group of friends. And they married in 1931 at a normal time in each of their lives. My mother was 22 years old when she married. My father was 24 years old. Pretty typical ages and young ages to be married in 1931. And they moved, which would also be typical of young couples today. They moved to the big city, which was Krakow. And they lived in an apartment. My father had a small business He had a partner, and they worked together fabricating like steel wool pads, like steel wool pads to clean pots and pans. That was their business. Some kind of sponges and other fabrics that you would use, material that you would use to clean pots and pans. And they had an apartment in Poland. They were, a typical young couple like you'd have anywhere in the world today. And about a year after they were married, my sister was born. Her name was Esther Levinstein. And 3 years later, they had a second child, it was my brother, Shmuel Menachem Levenstein. So my sister was born in 1932, my brother was born in 1935. And when history started to work against them, when the Nazis were coming to power, I mean, it was another country, they certainly heard the bad news, and my father would say, because I'd ask them, like, why didn't you leave? You heard what was coming out of Germany. But no one ever, I mean, we sit here on this side of history. They were sitting there before the event. My father said, well, times might be hard. We've weathered difficult times before. No one ever could have anticipated a civilized nation like the Germans who would be out to kill innocent people, especially women and children. They thought maybe the men needed protection, maybe they would try to get them in. No one could have anticipated such a heinous event as that. And when the Germans invaded Poland in 1939, initially my parents fled to my mother's hometown, the little shtetl, which wasn't that far away, thinking, who's going to find us, like out there in the boondocks? We'll be, it'll be quiet. We'll work. We'll live it through until the end. And then they realized soon after they arrived in Kashmir Zhiviyalki that things were not. They were probably even worse, and they were worse in the small towns because the Nazis, when they came to the smaller villages, they basically rounded up the people and took them out to the forest and shot them. And, there were always people who managed to hide, people who managed to run away, but it was actually, in some ways, in the initial stages, it was worse in the small towns than in the bigger cities. So they returned to Krakow. And eventually, I mean, it didn't happen right away, but by 1941, the ghetto was established in Krakow, and they had to leave their apartment and move into the ghetto. They lived, the four of them, so now it's 1941. My brother is 6 years old, my sister is 9 years old, and they shared what they called an apartment in the ghetto with my father's partner and his wife and their 2 children. So it was 8 people in 2 rooms. And they were, and they worked. I mean, they had jobs, they were in their 30s, they were young, they were healthy, they were fit, and they managed to work, and they managed to, one worked in the day, one worked in the night, so that someone was with the children, and they managed to just go day after day after day. I mean, I don't know enough details about what that life was like. I'm sure it was a life of hardship, but somehow they did manage. Until, from the beginning of 1941 until March of 1943. I think it's also before the war, or maybe just at the very beginning, they were in the country, clearly. My sister looks like she's maybe, she looks like she's about 7 years old, and she's on a bicycle, or playing on a bicycle, and it's my father and my sister from maybe like 1939, 38 or 39, the beginning of 39. So I'll pass this one from this side, just so you can have at least a picture of what it looked like. So when the ghetto Krakow was being liquidated, my father and his partner, in this apartment building, which I actually had been to once, when I went to Krakow with my husband and family, they didn't know what the future, they knew the future wasn't good, and they prepared what they called a bunker. Like they dug out literally a cellar in this apartment building in Krakow, stocked it with what they could, with some food and some blankets and pillows, and not knowing what the future would be. When ghetto Krakow was being liquidated, my father went with the deportation and left my mother and the children and this other woman, their business partner, and their 2 children hidden in this bunker, thinking, let's see what's going on, and then we'll find a way to come back for them. And they were taken to a work camp. It wasn't a death camp, but it was a work camp near Krakow called Plaszow. I don't know if has anyone in this room ever seen Spielberg's movie Schindler's List? Some of you have. Those who haven't should see it. Do you recommend that they see it? So my parents' story actually parallels that movie very dramatically. Plaszow was a very, terrible, terrible work camp. But people were killed, they were random killings, but there wasn't gas chambers, there wasn't systematic killings. And my father was there for about a week, and I have never heard my mother describe it, but you can only imagine a woman and 2 children in a basement, listening to footsteps overhead as Nazis were purging the ghetto of any remnants of Jews left behind, and not knowing what's going on, running out of food. She would sneak out at night to try to see if she could locate any other food, to try to feed the children, and they're hungry and they don't know what's going on. You don't even know where you are and what's going on. Eventually, my father actually, through a bold act, managed to commandeer somebody from Plaszow, a Gentile. He told them a story that he had some equipment, some machinery in the ghetto that he left behind, and if he would come with him, and he gave him a bribe, like a bottle of vodka, maybe a little money, would take a wagon, come with me back to the ghetto, and this machinery could be valuable, and let me bring it out. So he goes back into the ghetto, and he brings out my mother and the children, hiding them under blankets on this wagon. The guard saw what it was, and my father said, you don't have to say a word, you didn't have to see this. And he smuggled them into Plaszow. And I mean, I don't know how he did it. It was probably just an act of mazel that he was able to do it, and he did. We're in March of 1943. They survived together in Plaszow, the children hidden somehow in the bunk of the camp. Not the only children that were there. There were about 300 children hidden in Plaszow from March of 1943 until May of 1944. 14 months. 14 months. It's unfathomable to me. In May of 44, things were worse, and it's coming up. I mean, the yahrzeit that we commemorated always for my brother and sister, it was the 22nd of ER, so it's coming up next month. Plaszow, as a work camp, was also being demolished and liquidated, and everyone left there was being deported to Mamish concentration camps. And the day, it's depicted very vividly in the film, in Schindler's List, when the Nazis were playing. They said, my parents always said it was like Mother's Day, which does come on in the United States calendar. It's the middle of May, and it was about like May 14th, roughly, which corresponded then to the 22nd of ER. And they kind of lured all the children that were in that camp out and took them away. And that was really the end. They were taken to Auschwitz, which is not that far. And we don't know the exact date of the yahrzeit of my brother and sister, but we always use that day of their being taken away from Plaszow as the day we commemorated in our family as the yahrzeit. And there were many years, as I remember growing up, like Mother's Day is this big, if any of you come from the States and so remember, it's like a big deal holiday in America. Everybody makes a big deal about it. In our house, it was a somber day. It was never that kind of, and I never even understood that till I was older. So my brother and sister, who were 9, my brother was 9, my sister was 12. They were taken from their parents and killed at Auschwitz. My mother also, not at the same exact time, but also was taken to Auschwitz, where she worked for some time in the kitchen. It was now May of 44, and in January, if you know the history, Auschwitz was already liberated by the Russians, because it was further west in Europe. And before the Germans took the people and marched them, the death marches, and my mother was among those people who went from Auschwitz into Germany to Bergen-Belsen. So she went from Plaszow to Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, and there she wasn't liberated until a little bit later, until the British liberated in May, when the war was actually over. And she was so sick at that point that she was in a British-run hospital in Bergen-Belsen for about 6 weeks. My father's path was a little bit more fortunate after Plaszow, when they were separated. He was on Schindler's List, the famous Schindler's List, and doesn't know how he got on Schindler's List. He had no connection to Schindler, but it was, people knew that they had to list the Nazis when they took the facts down, like your name. You know, he had a chance to make a lot of money, and he did. But he couldn't abide when he couldn't stand by when he saw innocent, especially children, women, being killed randomly. And it's always been a mystery because he isn't what one would think of a man like Oskar Schindler. He was not the type of person you would describe if you were writing down the most moral, ethical kind of person. But yet for him, this was when he rose to a stature of heroism. And he used all the money that he had made in the war. He could have left. He could have gone somewhere. And, you know, he'd made a lot of money by 1944. He used all of his fortune. He used it for bribes. He used it in many ways for the sole purpose of saving the lives of these Jews. And just before they were going to be, liberation was coming also because Czechoslovakia is further west in the map of Europe, being liberated from Russia, which came earlier than the liberation from Americans or British. Oskar Schindler gathered all the people, all the Jews in the camp, and said to them, stay here, liberation is coming, don't go anywhere. It's my phone, good turn, sorry about that. And he had bolts of fabric. He distributed fabric to people. He said, you'll be able to sell this and have some money to start a new life. And he distributed, he even had some weapons, some guns. I'm sorry.
Apparently don't know the rules of YTS.
Yes, I'm sorry. I can't imagine who would be calling me at this hour. And it is remarkable because it's depicted so clearly in the movie, and I had heard that story long before Spielberg read the book or planned to make the movie. He distributed whatever weapons he had in case you need to protect yourselves, and he called the people, the Jews that he had saved, he called them my kingdom, my children. And he had to flee because initially, had they been liberated, you know, he's a Nazi to the outside world. No one knew exactly what his story was. So he felt he had to flee, but he left the people and did the best he could in the turn it off.
I can't figure out. Oh, it's your U.S. phone.
And he really provided for them. My father said that the fabric that he had from receiving this fabric gave him about $300, and it actually gave him something to start with afterwards. So he was a savior, and he was a real savior for the people that, you know, who were lucky enough to be on Schindler's List. Now the war for my father was over in February of 1945. My mother is still, he doesn't know where she is. They had planned to return back together to Krakow, and you can only imagine the chaos that existed. You know, as people were returning, other people weren't returning, and how do you find if there's any survivors in your family? Who's left? I mean, how are you going to find people? He went back to Krakow, met up with one nephew, and who said, you know, to him, Isaac, everybody is gone. It's lost. There's no survivors. Don't expect any survivors. And my father said to me when he was telling me the story once, he says, I knew there was no way for the children to have survived. They were too young. There was no way. But he said, I had a hope and a dream. just waited. And then when the war actually ended everywhere in Europe in 1945, refugees were allowed to travel by train without paying. Nobody had anything. They had no money. They had nothing. They were allowed to travel. They were just seeking people from my town. Just imagine, like, you know, you've been through a catastrophe like this and you don't know where anybody is, if anyone is. And he was traveling on a train. And you would meet somebody and you would say, where are you coming from? And they might say, I'm coming from Germany. Were there women there from Poland? Did you meet any women from Poland? Yes, I met women there from Poland. Did you meet someone named Sally Levinstein? And they said, I don't know if I met Sally Levinstein. People used to carry sacks of notes. Like, people would scribble their name on a note and say, if you meet someone from my town as you're leaving and I'm still here in the hospital, tell them I'm still alive. And he said, I don't know Sally Levinstein, but he sort of dumped out all his little note papers. My father saw her handwriting on a piece of paper. Only her handwriting, only her name. And so he knew she was alive, and he just went home, back to Krakow. They didn't have their apartment, someone had taken it over. There must have been places for people to stay, and he just waited. And one day, it was already probably close to July of 1945, she made her way back to Krakow. And you can only imagine the impact of that reunion and mourning their two children together, because they knew that they were gone. And they also knew they could not stay in Europe. This was not they had no home to go back to. They had to go somewhere. Everybody wanted to get to either the British or the American zone. They didn't want to be stuck behind the Russian zone. And they made their way, in my parents' case, to Austria. There was a displaced persons camp, and the town was called Wintermechel near Linz, Austria, and they were there from around August 1945 until a long time, until we came to America in September of '49. And you might ask, I mean, my mother in 1945 was already 37 years old. My father was 39 years old. They had lost their two children, and they had lost almost their entire family. I have a list here of all the members of the family who were killed. I mean, my mother was the baby of 8 children. Everyone was married. Everyone had children. At the end of the war, 2 sisters survived and 3 nephews. That was the entire family on her side that survived. My father was one of 4 children. Also, everyone married. Everyone had children. He had 1 brother survive and 2 nephews survived. And that was the entire family that survived. So they're in Wintermechel, and they felt like, you know, in a world like this, who would have children? I mean, who could have children now? And they just felt they survived, and they would just live out their lives quietly somewhere, you know, and until the end. And my mother was lucky enough to have a very good friend who still lives today in Tel Aviv. I should have her come speak to you next time. And she had a daughter born to her in 1947 in this DP camp. And she kept telling my mother, oh, you know, can you help me feed her? Can you help me bathe her, walk her? And she wanted to give my mother the feeling, like, of life, of, could I do this again? Could I have another baby? And fortunately for me, they did decide that they could, and they did. And I was born in this DP camp, this displaced persons camp, on November 7, 1948, 6 months after Hakamat HaMedina. There were a lot of babies born in those displaced persons camp after the war. People were very anxious to resume life and give life and prepare for their life, whether they could get to Medinat Israel after the state was formed, or wherever they were going in the world. And so here's my copy of my birth certificate that says here, General Refugee Hospital, and it has my name and the birthplace, and it says my father, Metal Arbater, he's still a metal sheet worker. Believe me, he was not handy with his hands. He was not a metal sheet worker. Truly, my mother was 40 years old when I was born, and even today, it's not it's not so unusual, but not very common for women to have babies at age 40. My father was 42. At that time, after everything that they had lived through, it was nothing short of a miracle. And that I was born, and and everyone in the camp was so happy for them and excited for them. In fact, my parents, in those years that they were in the displaced persons camp after the war, they were, does anyone know a little Yiddish? No. They were Unterführers, you know what that means? People were getting married. They were, young survivors. They were anxious to create a relationship with someone. They were getting married. They had no parents to bring them to whatever it was, to the chuppah. My parents were one of the very, very few couples from before the war. So they were a couple, and they married off dozens and dozens and dozens of people. And we would go wherever we would go and say, oh, I walked him to the chuppah, I walked her to the chuppah. They married off so many people because they were like a stand-in for the parents that these people didn't have anymore. And my parents decided after the doors were open to go to America that was where they would make their future life. And we came to America in September of '49, settled by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society in New York, in Washington Heights in New York. And my father went into business, and we moved to New Jersey. And we, thank God, had a good life. It was always like the life before for them and the life after. But they had even a life like before, because they had a real childhood in Europe. They could talk about life as it was before. So the last pictures I'm going to pass around is one of my parents shortly after the war in Vindermichel. It's a copy of the picture, so it's not very good. But, they already look like they're ready to start life again. And what is the great, great legacy to me of my parents and survivors is how they left behind what happened to them in the war, and many of them forged a life, with optimism, with values, with connection to Yahadut, and they somehow picked it up, and I think that is like the greatest gift that the survivor legacy gives to all of us, that despite what they've been through, that they could create a life of even happiness and goodness. And this is a picture of Oscar Schindler came to my cousin's 25th wedding anniversary in 1974, I think, or 72. Shortly before he died, they have him up on a chair, because if not for him, my cousin wouldn't have survived, my father wouldn't have survived, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. And this is my cousin, these are their survivors, this is Oscar Schindler clearly enjoying himself. This is my parents after the war, and this is actually one of the last pictures with my parents before my father passed away. It's from one of my son's bar mitzvahs. I'm blessed to have 5 children. So from saving my father, and they had only one, because life was, that was the biological clock was over for my mother by then. They were lucky to have one. Thank God I have 5. And these are my parents in later years, 1986 in New Jersey. So this is the last picture that I would leave you with. And this little girl knows Mrs. Jacobs very well. She spent a long time in your house when she was learning in Migdal Oz. She's now 27. But this picture is really the last one of our intact family with my parents. So I'll just pass that around and leave you with that, and ask if anyone would like to ask any questions. Okay. Thank you.
It's really unlikely, but I mean, your crazy stories, you guys look on Hashem to your sister or brother just in case, like America.
Yes, we did fill out, a long time ago, and it's, I mean, no one saw them go into the gas chambers, it's true, but, there just couldn't have been a chance, sadly. I mean, I have filled out, the page of memory, and so they're listed in Yad Vashem, along with all of my aunts and uncles and cousins, none of whom I knew. My grandparents had all previously died before the Shoah, my grandparents. but you know, so many aunts and uncles and first cousins. I grew up without any grandparents, and with only this one, you know, with basically, you know, 3 first cousins that I knew, and then their children. I mean, it was a very, very small family. So, you know, we just had, when we had our Pesach Seder 2 weeks ago, with my daughter and her entire family, we were, I had about 53 people at the Seder, and I'm going, wow, we used to have Seders with 4 of us. And this is, you know, in the next generation, it also, not only, I mean, it gives me a tremendous sense of gratitude to Hashem that the family has been reborn and flourishing again, but it also gives you a sense of what was lost. When you come from a family, many of you with your brother, you know, when you come from a family of whatever the number is, 4, 5, 6 children, and you're the only one left, and you rebuild your life from that. You know, but there is, I mean, it sadly could not have been a chance. Yes.
I saw the Schindler's List movie, but it was in like, I think it was in Russian or something, and I only saw it in subtitles. So I didn't quite understand what Schindler did exactly. So like, what exactly did he do, and how did it like help your father and cousin?
So there were two phases of what he did. First, in the days of the Krakow ghetto, he had a metal factory where they made, you know, I don't know, weapons supposedly. They made things for the German war machine in this factory. It was a metal factory that they converted for use for war. And Schindler was in charge of this factory. And he employed the Jews that worked in the factory, he took care of them. This is in the earlier years, like 1942, you know, into 43. He made sure people had food. He made sure that if you needed medical attention, you had medical attention. So I know a man who recently passed away, who was not on Schindler's List, but he had a few months where he worked in this factory, and he felt that those few months fortified him, like it gave him, like he could restore his health and his nutrition, you know, so that when he went from there to another camp, he had sort of a reserve. After, a little bit later, in 1944, in the spring of 44, toward the end of the war, he literally set up a completely fake camp in Czechoslovakia and claimed that he needed these specific people, who were all Jews, to come because they were trained, they knew how to work, they knew, and it's too late, you know, the war has been on for years. I need these people. I need you, and you, and you. I need these people, not new people, these people to come into my camp, to work, to produce what we're producing to help the Germans. It was all a charade. They never really produced anything. And he used his money to bribe whoever he needed to bribe, so that they wouldn't bother him about it. And he used his other money to buy food for everybody so that people had food to eat while they were there. He saved 1,200 people. So, you know, that's, it's, I mean, he's, of course, has a tree in Yad Vashem, in Yad Vashem. In the 1940s, he was an industrialist and a member of the Nazi Party. He was known as he was very handsome. He was a playboy. He loved making a good deal. He was a big drinker. He could drink anyone under the table. But this man, that's why I said he wasn't your typical moral, ethical person, but he was repelled by the Nazis' treatment of Jews. And he heard in the voices of his Nazi friends the death knell of Jewish people and the demise of civilization as he knew it. He could not keep still. He enlarged his factory, demanding more and more slave labor from the pool of the Krakow ghetto, who were Jews, and then the Plaszow concentration camp. He built on his premises a camp to house his workers, where he could surreptitiously feed them more than was allowed, and keep them alive in body and spirit. He spent his fortune on bribes and ended the war of Corker. I didn't get to that part about him. Under his care, 1,200 Jews survived, and some of the Jews who survived later supported him. After the war, Oskar Schindler and his wife ended up going to Argentina. They tried to have some kind of a farm. He never could even support himself. He never could make enough money just to support himself. He ended up going back to Germany. He really lived off of money that the Jews he saved would send him. And he died in 1974. He is buried actually in Yerushalayim on Har Zion, in a Christian cemetery on Har Zion. There was a grave for Oscar Schindler. I think I have a picture of it somewhere. Let's see if I can find out. Any other questions? Yes.
How did it affect your child or your parents?
Yeah, it's, I would say, I mean, my parents were not silent about it, although they didn't talk openly about their children. I knew that there was this catastrophe that had happened in their lives, you know, because I would hear about, you know, the brothers and sisters and close family members that were no more. But somehow they didn't impart that, they did not impart any kind of negativity to me. It's like they always remembered what they lost, but they forged a life of the future. I personally think they were remarkable people and that they were able to do that. And, you know, I mean, my father was a builder. He built homes and apartments, and every project that they built, they named the street Schindler. And until, you know, people who lived there, it's always a name. You know, after Spielberg's movie came out, like everybody suddenly thought, oh, they lived on this important street. But the fact that people, I think it is incredibly inspiring to be with people who, after what happened to them, can rebuild their lives, can learn to love and be optimistic and to not have bitterness. And my mother, whenever she spoke to any audience anywhere, she would always end her speech, I'm Mr. Rachman. I mean, they really were just remarkable in that way. They came to Israel probably 50, 60 times in their lifetime. I asked my grandfather why he didn't come here right away, because they were such Zionists, but he said, you know, I was too old. He said, I was 42 years old. I knew life in the new Medina would be so hard. And he says, if I were 22 years old, I would have gone. But 42 years old, he didn't think I had the courage to do it. So he had a chance to go to America, they went to America. But I really, it only affected me in making me a strong, optimistic, resilient person. Because if they could survive that and look like this, we could survive. You know, everybody has tragedies and losses in their life. We could survive.